words, and then our expert, Mike Van Clef, will give a brief presentation. So that will still leave us with plenty of time for all of your questions about native plants and invasive. This format, I'm going to start off with a few quick words, and then our expert.
Hold on just a moment while we get some technology settled.
So that will still leave us with plenty of time for all of your questions.
We are hearing back from the YouTube. Okay, you got it set? Great. Okay, so what we would like to do is start with a quick poll. Molly or Christine, are you able to launch the poll? Great, there it is. So what we're looking is for you to just think about what shade of green your thumb is. So you could be a landscaper or a gardening professional. You could be more of a backyard gardener with or without experience with natives, or you could be totally new to the subject of gardening. So we just like to get a little idea of what your background is as we go through tonight's seminar. We will just give another minute. It looks like most everyone has voted. Okay, so let's go ahead and end the poll, and if we could share the results. Everyone here is an active gardener. We have a few people that are new to gardening, about 15%, and we have a couple of landscaping or gardening professionals with us, but everybody else is an active gardener, about half of which are experienced with natives. So that's good information as we go forward. And let's move on. I just want to start with a few housekeeping items. Tonight's webinar is being recorded. If you have to leave early or you just want to share this with a friend, the recording will be made as soon as possible. We usually are able to get it up within a day. You can, at the time that it's available, find this recording on our website, sustainableprinceton.org. So go to the Ask an Expert section under events to find this. Tonight, we are very eager to get all your questions, as I mentioned, for our expert. The way you can ask them at any time during the presentation is to click on the Q&A bar that you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom window. We're going to do our best to answer every question, but because that's not always possible, we're also trying out a new feature tonight, which is the upvoting option. So you will have the opportunity, you should have the opportunity to see all of the other questions. And if there's one question that you really want to see the answer to, you can vote it up. And that helps ensure that we ask it. You can also comment onto other, if you have a related question to somebody else's, you can comment and add on to that question. So we think this feature will help us with tonight's seminar. If you leave tonight at seminar wanting to learn more, and we hope you do, please visit our website. Under the Take Action section of our website, we have a page on native plants. And here you can find other resources as well as local nurseries that sell plants. And I also want to take this moment to announce our upcoming Bio Blitz. We're going to be partnering with Friends of Princeton Open Space to launch our first Bio Blitz in Princeton. And the goal of this is to identify as many species as we can within Princeton. It can be any items like you're seeing here, plants, animal, fungi, anything, invasive, not invasive. So the goal is simply for you to get out, enjoy nature, and try to catalog some of the things that you're seeing. When you do find invasives, we're going to be using that data to help inform groups like the group that Mike is with, so that we can then use that information to have more informed removal of invasive plants.
So please check our website for full instructions later this week. If you participated in our last campaign, we'll have a few extra things with this one. So we encourage everyone to get involved and participate. And so stay tuned to learn more about that by the end of the week. So now I am extremely delighted to be introducing our expert for the evening. Mike Van Clef is the Stewardship Director for Friends of Hopewell Valley Open Space. He also serves as the Program Director of their Invasive Species Strike Team. Mike co-founded the strike team in 2008 with the goal of bringing greater efficiency and effectiveness to invasive species management. Mike has a PhD in ecology from Rutgers and over 25 years of experience in land stewardship, planning, and research, working extensively in the evaluation and management of rare and invasive species and deer management. So, without further ado, thanks so much for joining us tonight, Mike. I'm going to stop sharing my slides and we will get yours up momentarily.
Okay.
Okay, it looks like we're good to go. You're seeing the slide now?
Yeah, I think that's the that wasn't the introduction one.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah, there was 3 that I sent you.
All right, let's just take a minute. That should be an easy fix.
Its title is Princeton Van Clef Introduction.
I think it's this one, correct?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Mike, you just tell me when you want me to advance the slides.
Okay, you can go to the next one.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to go through these first handful or so of slides pretty quickly. I just want to sort of show you what the strike team is all about. Our mission is to protect natural lands through coordinated strategic invasive species control. So we're a statewide program and we receive information from around the state. All that information gets gathered and reviewed and we're able to put that back out there so everyone has a better sense of what's going on in invasives, in the world of invasives. So very quickly, we do mapping, data analysis, and reporting. We do outreach. We do training sessions, and we search for and eradicate invasive species. Next. And we have a bunch of people that are staff. We are all very part-time. Some very part-time, some a little less part-time, but all part-time. But the point of this, showing this large group of people, is that we have a lot of expertise. So there's definitely a good crew of people, the core of the strike team. And yeah, so you can see all those folks, lots of land stewards and such doing the work. Next. We also have a statewide steering committee. Again, that kind of keeps us in the loop of what's going on throughout the state. Next. And we have a technical advisory committee. And these people are really essential to us knowing what to put on our lists and how to rank it. So we have experts that know about all kinds of different taxa, plants, animals, pests, pathogens, aquatics, you name it. So we have this great group of people that help us inform our decisions. Next. And just wanted to pause on this particular initiative, the local strike teams. There are groups out there that have formed independently of us, and we help them when we can or provide advice or things like that. But it really is fantastic to see these groups. I mean, they just knock themselves out. Essentially, it's all volunteer. And we are trying to encourage other local strike teams from forming, because it's pretty obvious to us when we look at the entire state, we obviously can't do it all. So we need, folks out there protecting the natural areas around where they live. And they often form cores of very dedicated people that are making remarkable progress on invasive species just through incredible amounts of hard work. Next. And I can't do a presentation without quickly going through the why do we care part, because when you're dealing with invasives a lot, you're bombarded by bad news on a daily basis. And I'll just show you a couple of slides. Next. And New Jersey is just phenomenal. We get a bad rap, but anyone that's been out in the natural areas throughout the state knows there's a lot of special things everywhere, from Cape May to Sussex County. All these incredible places are in New Jersey. Next. 2,000 native species, 1,000 non-native species. Again, lots of diversity from pine barrens to our portion of the Appalachian Mountains and everything in between. Next. And I know some people are struck by the amount of species that we have, and you just quickly look at that and see there are many, many things to see. These are all native species. So from 62 mammals to 180 dragonflies and damselflies. We still have wildness in New Jersey. We have black bears, we have timber rattlesnakes, we have globally rare northern meadowlark butterflies towards the lower right. We have federally threatened bog turtles to the left, and New Jersey is a stronghold for them. So we have a lot to tout, a lot of value, a lot of conservation value. Next. And the overarching goal is to have healthy plant communities. I mean, typically our forests in New Jersey are not healthy for a variety of reasons, primarily deer overabundance and the tag teaming of deer overabundance supporting invasive species. But when's the last time you saw a forest like that? There are places in Princeton that are getting there. Parts of Herrontown Woods and Autumn Hill have some of an understory, but even at that, they're lacking key components of the herbaceous layer. Next. And sure, we have a lot of impacts. You can read that list again. I want to kind of get into the question and answer part, so I want to move through these fairly quickly. But we've done collectively, we've created this problem, all of us. And I'm a strong proponent of stewardship, so mitigating those human impacts on natural areas. Next. Okay, next. So one thing you can do, and I assume many folks that do work with natives in their garden know about dogtalamine, this sort of kind of battle cry of garden as if life depends upon it. When you look at a map of land use and you see usually red is the color for development, and we've developed quite a bit of the state, there's no reason that the red that is assigned to your home has some areas that you could give back by planting native species. And the idea is to create a sort of a living garden, a living almost like just be part of the food web, so you plant things that you hope some bugs will eat so that birds could eat those bugs, etc. So planting natives is really the best way to do that. They've been here for millennia, and the things that eat them have been here for millennia. And if you create the habitat, there is, that is a cliche, but it is true. It's the field of dreams. You build it, they will come. You plant natives and you get all kinds of things starting to happen. So you could do basic, this sort of you know, the extremes are from a garden, a very well manicured garden, sort of the upper left photo, where no one who doesn't know anything about plants will think that there's native plants there. They just look like a beautiful garden, and you could do that with natives. You can also have more of like the English cottage garden. You could have a full-blown meadow, or what I've done in various parts around my house just to play around is create meadow patches. So the lower right has a meadow patch that has a shape, and that often is good for neighbors that are nervous about meadows. Just having a larger meadow, if you have a contained meadow, so to speak, it still functions. Obviously, the bigger the better, but even small meadows have a lot of great ecological function. Next. And one way to think about you know, how to use natives is by their function. So again, you could have meadow patches, foundation plantings, screening plants, ground covers, shade gardens. All of these things, there's native plants to fit all of these roles. So, you know, there's really no shortage of possibilities of using native plants. Your entire landscape could be native, and it could take on many forms. Next. One thing that we hope people will, we have a voluntary landscape planting pledge, and I know Princeton has you know, made activity on this a few years ago, I guess, about kind of letting people know that, you know, this invasive species problem exists and people should avoid planting particular things. So we have an updated list for 2020, and we hope that people will voluntarily not plant invasive species. So what if you looked on the right-hand column of each side, it says problem type. So there's widespread species. Those are ones that are out there. There's emerging species, which is usually a big focus of the strike team, the things that aren't widespread yet. And then there's a type called potential, and those are ones that we're sort of watching. We're not sure. We've heard reports of them spreading in other places, or we see some spreading in New Jersey. We just don't know yet. So this is a pretty conservative list. And there's really no reason not to be conservative when there's so many plant choices, native and non-native, that are not invasive. So we put this list out there and update it annually. Next. Okay, so for invasive control, yeah, the slide needs a lot of work, but I just wanted to look on the left-hand column. There's different types of ways to approach invasive plant control. So there's biological control, and that's the experts with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and universities develop insects. If a plant is introduced from somewhere else in the world, then an insect in that part of the world eats it. And then they work on it to make sure, bring it over here and make sure that it's not going to eat anything other than the invasive plant. So that works. When it works, it's great, but it's often a 15-year plus research project. So if you have hundreds of invasive plants, don't expect biological control to deal with all of them. It'll be a tiny fraction. Mechanical control is just cutting, which typically doesn't work, or it could be pulling, which can work for particular species like, say, garlic mustard, but it's fairly limited. Chemical control involves various techniques using herbicides to eliminate invasive species. Cultural control, it depends on, you know, what kind of site you're talking about, but it's more of if we do things in different ways, can we get less invasive species? And then ecological control is kind of the holy grail. And that's completely dependent on significant reduction in the deer herd. So I've seen many places, larger exclosures, when you eliminate deer from the picture, not even or reduce it significantly, remember that in most places we have more than 10 times the proper amount of deer, the ecological sustainable amount of deer. So when you do reduce the deer population, many native species will come back on their own. We're not going to herbicide or pull or cut our way out of the invasive species problem. Ultimately, we need ecological control that reduces the deer population and allows native species to compete effectively. Next. So yeah, I never got into this business thinking, I was and still am proudly a tree hugging berry picker. So I would have never thought 25 years ago that I'd be using herbicide. But, to me, it's a difficult but necessary decision. It would be worse if we didn't. So, so it really is the only option in most situations. We use the smallest amount in the most targeted application method that we can. And remember, as a homeowner, so I'm generally talking about natural areas. You could definitely use or not use a herbicide at the home level. If you have a smaller property, every point is reachable within a few minutes or less. You could do more mechanical control and repeated cutting and things like that, and avoid or significantly reduce any need for herbicide. But certainly in natural areas that are larger, you have to walk a mile to get to the spot. Herbicides really are the only practical way to deal with invasive species. Next. So we have guidance on our website. We have different methods, and we give shorthands to them. FS1 is foliar spray #1. Moving on down, the basal bark method, the cut stump method, the hack and squirt method, and we have different herbicides. So we basically say, if you're going to make, use what percentage of herbicide would be in these particular methods. So that's all been calculated for people. And I'm not sure if I included so there's the other table that goes along with this that I didn't include, is how many ounces do you put in to make a gallon of mix. So we've done all the math for everyone. So if someone feels like they want to use herbicide, every single invasive plant in New Jersey, we have a recommendation, one of these or more, to eliminate the species using herbicide, and we tell you exactly how to go about making the mix for it. Next. And just one example. So Japanese Aurelia is something that is emerging in Hopewell and Princeton. We have been working on it along with the Friends of the Herrontown Woods folks and Friends of Princeton Open Space at Mountain Lakes, eliminating the populations that we know of in Princeton. So the Herrontown Woods is virtually eliminated. And we're continuing to work with Fopos, and Princeton has hired the strike team as a contractor to work on the Aurelia at Mountain Lakes, as well as other species. But this is definitely one to keep your eyes on while you're out and about in town, because it's very possible there's other pockets that we haven't found yet. But the other point of using this slide was to say this is what our recommendations look like in the white box. So we say FS1, that's foliar spray #1. That would be for a smaller individual, less than 4 feet tall. BB1 is basal bark application, and that would be for larger individuals. And CS1 is cut stump treatment that you could do effectively in winter only, not in the summer. So I'm not going to go over every aspect of this, but just to give you an idea, every single species invasive plant has a recommendation like this that people could use if they wanted to treat it. And I think that's my last slide. Yep.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Mike. So we've already got a few questions coming in. Just as a reminder, you can still enter questions into the Q&A bar that's at the bottom of your screen. You can also upvote by clicking the little thumbs up other questions or comment on them if you have an addition to those questions. So I just wanted to start with a couple of my questions, if I can. I read, or the summary at least, the introduction for the New Jersey Strategic Management Plan for Invasives. And I noticed in that introduction, there was a statement that there are more species of native orchids in New Jersey than Hawaii. So I was floored by that. Is this actually true?
That is true.
And where are these orchids in New Jersey?
Yeah, they're around. A lot of them are in boggy places, North and South Jersey. Probably the most likely to be seen in the Princeton area would be something like ragged fringed orchid, which is actually the picture on the first, the slide that had, you know, the title of the presentation. So that is definitely somewhere in Princeton. You know, you don't see like a colony of 1,000 of them. That's the thing with orchids. Sometimes you just see one or two in a little patch.
I see.
But yeah, this crazy orchid in the introduction is definitely in the Princeton area.
Okay, great. So speaking of the plan, it's definitely looks like it involved a lot of effort. It's over 200 pages. What's the current status of that plan?
There is none, unfortunately. Yeah, that was put together about 10 years or so ago. And unfortunately, just as the plan was coming out, the New Jersey Invasive Species Council, which had hired me as a contractor to write the plan, was disbanded. So none of the recommendations were ever implemented. So it is out there. There is a plan. It's just sort of dead in the water as of now. And the one thing that, for me personally, that came out of it was I started looking into, you know, different groups and what they were doing out around the country, and I turned on to, I think it was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had something called, surprisingly enough, the Strike Team, which I thought was a great name. And one of the recommendations in the plan is the Strike Team. So we have been implementing that, but that has not been, you know, part of a particular state effort, and certainly not funded by the state.
Okay, so is there anything that a citizen could do if they were interested in seeing that action taken? Is there any activity they could jump onto?
I mean, the one thing is that, well, one is voluntarily not purchasing native plants. So there's no rules or regulations out there. You could buy the most invasive thing in the world or every single plant on that list I showed you if you wanted to. There's nothing against that legally, but we hope that people will voluntarily, you know, refrain from it, you know, reach out to their nurseries and let them know that you know about invasive species, let them know that you want native species. You know, and there's obviously a whole other route of, well, that's sort of like what you could do as an individual. You know, and there's obviously routes of advocacy and talking to people in government, you know, local, county, and state, you know, about concerns about invasive species. You know, any municipality, county, or whatever can say that we're not going to buy invasive species out either. New developments often have could have restrictions. A municipality could put restrictions on a new development that they can't plant any invasives or must plant all natives, things like that.
Okay, okay, good. But I like that idea of using your dollar power. So going out and purchasing natives and speaking to store owners, nursery owners about the fact that you want natives. So that's great. So we have a couple of questions that have come in about deer that have risen to the top of the list. So let's start with those. John Landau asked, what useful deer management options are available to a homeowner in a deer populated neighborhood?
Yeah, it is tough. I mean, so there's state regulations that require, they're called safety zones. So you can't discharge a bow if within 150 feet of a structure. A firearm is 450 feet from a structure. So in a neighborhood, it would be very difficult to actively hunt for deer. It can be done in very limited situations, but it would be difficult. I mean, I think you're more, think more about creative fencing solutions and deer repellents within a neighborhood, because it would be very hard to reduce the population. But when I do a full presentation on native plants, I sort of talk a little bit about using fencing. One of the key concepts is, although if you have a large deer exposure, the thing has to be at least 7.5 foot tall. Deer could exert themselves and get over that, but they're very unlikely to want to exert themselves that much to get over 7.5 feet. If you have your home and you have foundation plantings, you could put up a much small, thinking of like a relatively narrow strip, say between a sidewalk and the house where you have a planting area, you could probably get away with even a 3.5 foot fence. If the area between the sidewalk, say, and the house is only, say, 5 feet, deer are not going to jump into a small space because it's hard for them to get any kind of momentum to jump back out. So they're hesitant to jump into small spaces. So you could play around and experiment with creative, attractive fencing materials and create safe zones where you could plant wherever the heck you want. So that's just something to consider.
Yeah, and that makes sense. That's been my personal experience at one place where I lived in New Jersey. I had a shorter fence just because it was surrounded garden boxes and they were 2 feet high. And so I figured that they wouldn't jump into it just because it would be unstable landing for them. And it seemed to work.
Yeah, it is interesting how what deer will or won't do, but it does work, like you said. And you can play around with it. Maybe your deer needed to be 3 feet tall or 3.5 feet tall before they feel anxious. It's all about the height versus the distance, the amount of area within being kept from deer. So if the area is relatively small, you don't really need a very tall fence because they don't want to jump in and then not be able to easily jump back out.
Right. Okay, so we have another question about deer from Scott Sillers. With the dominance of invasive species in many cases, will eliminating deer solve the problem, or have we altered the ecosystem too great to an extent?
The more altered it is, the slower the recovery would be. I mean, I think the way to look at it, and I've done a lot of work with Duke Farms, and actually we're putting together a paper to publish a paper on about 10 years of research. So they have a deer exclosed area, which actually has a few deer in it. And then they have areas that aren't deer exclosed. They've reduced their deer population to somewhere between 25 and 30 deer per square mile outside of the exclosure. And there's recovery. It's not as fast as inside the deer exclosure, where there's more of an equivalent to about 10 deer per square mile, but it is happening. And the way to look at it, I mean, and maybe I'm forced to look at that because it's, I'm a steward, and you want to find ways to show success. But one way that we looked at it was the proportion of native to non-native species. So if you, at any point in the woods, you might have, half as many natives as non-natives. When you have really good deer management, you could turn that ratio around, make it more 1 to 1 or 1.5 to 1 or even 2 to 1. And I think that's a more realistic stewardship goal. We're not going to eliminate all invasives, but we want to increase the proportion of native to non-native species cover in our natural areas.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have a lot of different questions here. I'm just thinking through one that is interesting is the idea of edible invasives. So Louise is asking, can we name some invasives that are edible? Emily responded that garlic mustard is one of them. I was not aware of that. And if they are edible, does that help in some way control the population?
Locally, it could. I mean, there's definitely different books out there on edibles. Locally, Tama Matsuoko does wild foraging, Meadows and More, if you want to visit her website. And she's written a couple of books as well. So there's all kinds of, first you have to know what to do with them, right? Or which one first, and then what to do with it second. So there are certainly things that are edible that are out there. We've restarted our potluck last year in October that we hope to be able to do this year. We're not sure yet. But there's definitely people that, even if they know how to make one of the dishes, they bring it with them. It's a really fun event if folks are interested in that, if we do actually have it at the end of October. So there's people out there, there is an interest. Garlic mustard's a pretty good example. You can certainly dent a patch of it, and one of the most common things to do with it is make pesto. So early in the year, in April or so, you could pick it, take the leaf blade off of the rest of the plant, throw it in a blender and grind it all up and make it like you're making pesto, replacing the basil, I guess. So there's definitely things that are locally available and edible. I doubt there's enough people to move the needle on a big scale, but on a local scale, you could definitely knock down a patch of garlic mustard and eat it.
Yeah, interesting. Great. So Archana is asking about bamboo. She is saying that she sees a lot of it in her neighborhood. I think it's definitely in pockets all around Princeton. Is it a problem, and in what way?
Yeah, so it's a funny species. So we don't have it on our list. And the reason why we don't have it on our list, because ours is mainly involved with natural areas. And what we've never seen is bamboo spreading on its own away from where it's been planted. Now, if it were planted, it can kind of like incrementally grow and get pretty big, a pretty big patch of it, but you won't find it 100 yards away, for example. So it is a major problem where it's been planted, and that typically is a neighbor planted it and now it's going into your yard. So it is definitely a problem for you. But we don't consider it a true invasive because it doesn't really spread far away from where it's been planted. But it can cause enormous damage. And it is quite challenging to kill, especially if you want it gone from your side of the fence, but the neighbor who planted it wants to keep it. So it is challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of it going up through pavement in people's driveways from their neighbors, stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of municipalities have banned it. So, there's some precedent. I'm sure that Milburn has. I'm not sure who else may have done it, but because it's just a huge, neighbor dispute problem, just for no other reason than that. I think that's probably a good enough reason all by itself.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to move to a question from Sarah Roberts. She has 3 wooded acres on her property where she is planting natives and removing invasives. And so her question is around the idea of how do you balance that? Garden weeds are spreading in. So she's talking about hairy bittercress, dead nettle, ground ivy, moneywort, chickweed, and some little vetch. I've got, I think, a little bit of all of that too. But then she's putting in spring beauties, trout lilies, false mermaid weed, wild ginger, Pennsylvania sedge, and other plants that could be shaded out by these weeds. So she's been pulling them, but they are spreading faster than she can keep up with. So what do you recommend?
Hi, Sarah. We've met before. There's no real quick solutions. And, one way of slowing things down is to establish native shade over things, shrub layers and things like that. So planting maybe some faster growing native shrubs would help your wild ginger, for example, by reducing the competition. It's more shade tolerant than some other species, so that might help. There really is no easy answer to this, as I'm sure you're aware. But I think that is one way, is trying to get some shade over things using native shrubs that are faster growing, like a spice bush, like a black haw, and hope that kind of reduces the competitive abilities of some of the invasives versus some of the natives that are more shade tolerant. But it really is a difficult situation. It's sort of a case by case, spot by spot basis. Sometimes, you might consider, if you have a big stiltgrass problem, you might consider using a pre-emergent herbicide, or adding lots of wood chips. That seems to help in some ways too, for certain invasives, putting them down. So yeah, I don't really have a general answer, but on a case by case basis, try to figure out how to protect one particular area. And it might be also too, one of the stewardship principles is knowing what you can't do. So if you have a certain amount of property, you might just say, okay, well, on 20% of it, I'm going to make it, really good, really just filled with natives with no invasives, and spend all of your effort in that 20% of the property, so that you could have one really good area, and other areas you might not be able to do much about.
Right. Yeah. And that's certainly been my experience. Also, I feel like I'm full-time pulling up stiltgrass now, but the good news is during the pandemic, I do have time to do that, at least, because in the past it's been more of a problem. So there was a question about, I'm having a hard time finding it now, but one of the attendees asked about poison ivy. They understand that it's a native and that it's beneficial, but for birds, but because they're highly allergic, and many of us are, they want to remove it. And so what could they plant there instead? Other people just ask more generally, what is the best native plant for birds?
So poison ivy, like other vines, native and non-native, can be very difficult to control. Vines generally have a lot of biomass below ground. So, even if you spray something on them, it'll kill the top part. The terminology is top killing. So yeah, it gives you some satisfaction for a second or two while the top dies, but then the root is still alive and it sends out new sprouts. So you have to watch that for any vine, poison ivy included. They do sell different herbicides that are specific to poison ivy, or in general vines. They usually have pictures of poison ivy on the label and that kind of thing, and it's like a little squirt bottle, and you can kind of, if you keep up with it, you could probably ultimately get control over it. And it just depends on how bad it is. Obviously, poison ivy could be 4 inches around vine, 40 feet up a tree, or it could be just a few leaves popping out of the ground. Cutting the stems so that if it is way up in a tree, cut the stems at the bottom to at least get rid of that part of it. And then, little sprouts that pop up all over the spit place, you can get an herbicide that's sort of advertised as poison ivy control.
Okay, great. So then let's talk about English ivy if we can. Jennifer is also asking for a good replacement for that. She has lots of it, lots of periwinkle, and then the poison ivy that we just about. She's removed some, but the removal is requiring a replacement. And the English ivy has been working to keep the weeds down. So if you want to try wintergreen, food for the birds, Waldstinia and mitrewort, but I fear they're not fast growing or near aggressive enough to keep the weeds at bay. So any suggestions on what would bring in the insects that would bring in the birds?
And a lot of hard questions.
I know, right? It's a good one. I can reread if you need it.
Yeah, there's not going to be a native counterpart that's as robust as a Pachysandra or a English ivy or a Vinca. I don't know, unless someone else does. I don't really know of anything that's comparable in its dense growing habit that's native like those non-native species. And English ivy, by the way, is harder to see in this part of the state, but you go down to South Jersey and you'll see just how invasive English ivy is. It is popping up everywhere in natural areas. So it is definitely good to replace it if you can. But yeah, it's hard. I mean, miterwort is pretty meek as a ground cover. Wintergreen would be also pretty meek as a ground cover. You know, I don't really know what to recommend. I mean, wild ginger is making an incredible mat in my shade garden.
Yeah, mine as
But
well.
But I don't know how long yours took to do that, but mine took about 7 or 8 years. So
Oh,
it wasn't
no,
that.
mine's been much quicker. It's been about
Oh, that's good.
two at the most.
Oh, that's great. Yeah,
Yeah.
so that might be a good choice then. If that, and maybe, and that might be because I'm not growing in the Piedmont, it might be the soils that I'm on. So if it does great on the Piedmont soils of Princeton, then shoot, that is a really good one.
Yeah, I'm not going to say, there have been things that have popped up in it, but it hasn't, it's much better than nothing for sure, because it has those broad leaves and it mounds. So we have another bird question, and Hillary Persky added the comment of, what about native grapes for birds and insects?
I'm sorry, I missed that. Native what?
So she added, what about native grapes for birds and insects?
Native grapes, okay.
She
native,
also added native buttercup as a potential ivy replacement.
okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar personally with it. The grapes are certainly a great wildlife food. They have a lot of value. The fruits have a lot of value for wildlife. They can be challenging for your trees though. They can get really extensive and they can create problems for trees. I mean, the way vines tend to damage trees, some vines girdle, they twirl around the tree as they grow and it girdles them eventually. And then things like grapes don't do that, but the weight of the stem, the weight of the vine is more than the tree could bear, especially like in an ice storm. So you can lose limbs off of a tree and things like that. So you have to be pretty careful with grapes because they are fairly aggressive natives.
Got it. So in terms of ground covers, we had a couple of people make suggestions. Susan Landahl suggested that golden ragwort or sedges, they're not as robust, but they might be considered. And Scott Sillers suggested Virginia creeper. What do you think of those?
The ragwort I have, so it's definitely a good ground cover and it's evergreen and it makes beautiful yellow flowers in the spring. I have had people upset with me that I've shared plants with because sometimes Senecio goes totally bonkers. If your property is a little bit moister, a little bit sunnier of a spot, moisture of a spot, Senecio could be super duper aggressive, which is great if you want a lot of it. But sometimes people are a little disturbed by how good it is at doing its job.
Right.
I have a nice patch because I have it in a relatively dry spot that's a little more shaded, and it's a slowly growing patch, and it's beautiful, especially in flower. So yeah, that is a good choice, and I totally went over my head before. And then what was the other one? The Senecio, and then there was another species that was mentioned.
Virginia creeper.
Virginia creeper, okay. And that's a great native. It can make a good ground cover. In deep shade, it turns the most beautiful dark green blue color that you can imagine. It's so lush in the shade. but it is also aggressive. So you just got to watch, it will grow up trees and shrubs and everything else around it. So you just have to make sure that, if there's not a lot for it to grow up on, or if you stay on top of it and don't let it grow up, a favored tree or something like that, then it can be a great species. If you had it isolated on a trellis by itself, it's a great vine for that too. The fall color is stunning, and the fruits are extremely valuable. They have a lot of fat in them, so migrating birds love to eat Virginia creeper seeds. Fruit.
Great. Okay, so I've got another question from Jennifer Eichmann, who's asking she's saying that someone told her that plants should be grouped. So you don't want to just put one of each. Rather, you want to plant a group of Monarda or Asclepias. Did I say that right? Otherwise, they're not helpful to butterflies. So you need a critical mass in order to help wildlife. Would you agree with that?
I think it would make them more apparent to a pollinator in this case, right? If you think about how things grow in nature, things do tend to be grouped naturally. So I tend to agree with that idea. I can't say I have some empirical proof or anything like that, but there is some sense to planting things in groups of 3s and 5s, even just aesthetically. And one of the things about planting things singly, especially if you're dealing with invasives and this and that and the other thing, is they get lost in the shuffle pretty easily. So if you have a clump of milkweed or butterfly milkweed or whatever, you kind of know where it is and you can defend it more because it's more apparent to you. You can remember where you put that clump as opposed to one species somewhere in your garden.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with that point. I think you're right. It makes it easier to identify them. But then I agree also that it's just more visually stunning sometimes to have that big clump of gorgeous flowers. So I never thought about the wildlife potential of that before, but that's an interesting idea. Okay, so what about dogs? When we're thinking about weeds, Barbara Coffey is asking, what can we do to kill weeds that's safe for our pets?
Yeah, I think one of the things, once I don't really know specifically about pets and herbicides, just to be honest with you. I'm not usually using them in that context. But when you spray herbicide onto a leaf of a plant, typically within minutes it's dry, and it's unlikely to transfer from the plant to your dog, for example. So I don't perceive there to be a potential big risk there, as long as the dog's not around while you're actually spraying, and maybe you keep the dog away for an hour or so afterwards, let everything dry. I would think that there's pretty minimal risk from that point.
Okay.
It's just really, you don't want to obviously have the herbicide in a mobile form and your dog not knowing and running around. It was a horrible story that often when you spray herbicides, you put a blue dye in it to indicate, so the person spraying it knows what's been sprayed and what's not been sprayed.
Oh.
And someone it was a whole meadow restoration where they were using equipment and stuff, and the landowner let their dog out and the dog came back the color blue. So you want to avoid things like that, obviously, for sure.
Right.
If that did happen, you would wash your dog immediately. But I think that the main thing is that don't let them out while it's still wet and it can get on their fur or their nose or anything like that.
Right. And are these sort of things noted on labels? Is it something where if you're reading the label, you'll get a sense?
Probably. Like I said, I've never really thought about it because I'm usually in the middle of a forest somewhere doing it.
Right.
But I'd imagine that the labels have some indications on them.
Okay. All right, good. All right, so Louise Wilson is asking if you can recommend a resource that includes photos of the most common and or problematic invasives in New Jersey, especially our area, central New Jersey.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any one source. I mean, we have, we obviously have our do not plant list. So there's a source of species there. We have our phone app. The Strike Team has a phone app, which is actually going to be getting an update fairly soon. But that app can almost be used as a guide. If you can get it on app, the iTunes or whatever, and the Droid store, or whatever they call their thing. But actually, I don't know, maybe you could, I don't know if this works. Can you see this at all?
Oh, no, unfortunately, we were just seeing a white screen.
I'll forget it. Okay.
But yeah, I have the app. It's the New Jersey Invasive Species Strike Team app, right? Isn't that what it's called?
Correct. Yep, that's
Yeah.
the one. And there's a button, you can hit the I button for each species and see pictures and a written description for each one.
And it's organized by type of species. So there'll be trees, and then there'll be animals, insects, that sort of thing. So if she just wanted a list of like the top 10 for our area, maybe that's something we can put together. But you don't think that there is one right now?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think I had sent a plan that I had done for the Princeton Ridge on one of the emails earlier this week or last week, whatever. But there's a list of invasive species that were discovered throughout Princeton, and it's going to be more than 10, but I think I had it by the amount of each one. So you could say, what are the 10 most common from one of those tables in the report?
I see. Okay.
But no, there's nothing prepared, so to speak, ready to go right this second. It would just have to be taken from other sources.
Right. There is a report I've come across where, and I can't recall right now who puts it out, but it has lookalikes. So it has like the native honeysuckle beside the invasive honeysuckle to help you identify. So we could pull that up and have that as a resource. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
There's a couple that rings a bell for two. There's one that Betty Ann Kelly from Union County put out, Plant This, Not That. And that was a comparative thing. And then Brooklyn Botanic Garden years ago had I'm looking on my bookshelf because I'm trying to remember the name, but Brooklyn Botanic Garden had a book, and it might still be for sale on their website, native alternatives to invasives. So that was a really nice book.
Okay.
So there's a couple options out there. I don't believe that the Union County one is in print anymore, but it's possible it's somewhere electronically. I don't know.
Okay. And Barbara Coffey has a similar question. Are there good guides for native species?
Yeah, as far as like just kind of botanizing out in the woods kind of a thing, or?
I assume so. Barbara, if you want to add on to that, feel free to add a comment to clarify. But yeah, let's assume she means just a book type of guide or website.
I mean, the thing that I cut my teeth with was Newcomb's Wildflower Guide. It isn't trees and shrubs, it's wildflowers, but I think it's a great book. It has its own unique key system that's relatively easy to use. And I still flip through it. And in the more modern stuff, I mean, I think iNaturalist is pretty phenomenal. And I can only imagine it's going to get better and better the more people use it. But that's a great way to learn things from, and that's plants and bugs and everything. So it's a great free app that's out there, and I would definitely recommend it. I was having fun with it last year. Someone told me about it. It's been around for a while, but someone said, you should try it. It's really neat. And I'm like, I don't know, technology.
I know.
And then I was like, there's plenty of butterflies. I'm mostly a plant guy, so I know more about plants than any other type of things. And, sure, there's tons of butterflies I've seen a million times. I have no idea what they're called. And I just started taking pictures of them with iNaturalist, and now I know what they're called. So it's a really neat app. So I definitely recommend it.
Yeah, no, of course. I'm glad you're putting another plug in for our activity. I totally agree. And I've learned really rapidly through it, various things that I never thought I'd learn to identify. So that's exciting. Chi has a question. She has seen garlic mustard growing in the Institute woods. So this is a question I commonly have too. Am I allowed to just pull it, or do we need to wait to be a part of an official crew? Do we need to report it? So we talked about the app, how you can use the Strike Team app to report it. But what about the idea of just pulling it up?
Yeah, I mean, if you do, garlic mustard is definitely one of those species that you can control without herbicides if you're super persistent. So if you were going to make sure you got all or most of it in a given year, and you went back to that same spot every year for several years, you could eliminate it. It does have a really long seed bank, so stuff will keep popping up out of the soil. And of course, it's a biennial, so the ones that have shot up and made flowers, if you pull them before the fruit starts forming, you've just eliminated new seed for the future. I mean, it might be a case, yeah, you could sort of probably do it on a kind of a invasive vigilante kind of thing, just
Yeah.
just do it. If you wanted to have a more concerted effort and maybe find other people, like-minded people that wanted to protect Institute Woods, you could form, an Institute Woods strike team. Talk to the people that manage it, let them know what you're doing, and have work days and stuff like that, in April, and try to eliminate garlic mustard from particular areas of the property.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great idea, especially when we've got all this pent up frustration to put it out on the garlic mustard that's everywhere.
Yeah.
So I really like that idea. So when you do that, can you leave it laying in the trail to die, or do you have to? So as long as you do it before it fruits, is that the idea that you, or is it considered, the plant material itself is considered problematic, so you want to take it out with you?
No, I mean, I think you just want to keep those seeds from forming.
Okay.
If you pull it early in the year when it's just flowers and you don't see that little narrow seed pod that it makes, if you just see flowers, you pull it out of the ground, lay it on the surface of the ground, it's done. It'll never. I mean, they're phenomenal. You might actually, if it rained a couple of days after you did that, you might see that stem starts to go up, even though it's laying on the ground and the roots are on the surface of the ground. But it's doomed. There's no way it's going to make seeds if it hadn't, if it wasn't already almost done ripening them at that point. So you could lay it on the ground if you pick it early enough. If you pick it later and you see the seed head starting to form, what I've done is pull the plant and then rip the seed part off of the bottom of the plant and throw the unripened seeds on the side.
Okay.
So yeah, because even the plant out of the ground with its roots intact that you pulled out of the ground, if the seeds are almost ripe, it'll have enough juice left in it to ripen them.
I see. Okay.
But if you
That makes
pull the
sense.
seed head off of the rest of the connection to the root, it's not going to ripen at that point. That's it. It's done.
Right. Okay. Great.
If you get there really late and the seeds are already ripe, you might want to pull the whole thing up, rip the seed part off, and put the seed part in a plastic bag and throw it away.
Okay.
You don't have to
Or
put
a
the whole
paper
plant.
bag.
Yeah, anything to just to keep it from spreading the seeds.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's switch gears to lesser celandine. Chris is asking what the best method is for getting rid of it. Can we just rip that one up too?
That's really hard. I know Steve Hiltner locally has been going after it, new populations that have been forming. And I believe, it makes, I don't even know the correct botanical term, but it has like a tiny little tuber, smaller than your pinky nail, definitely smaller than your pinky nail. And there could be thousands, millions, depends on how big of an area, any square inch could have 10 of them in a population that's fully blown. So you could pull, it's hard to pull up because it's kind of a small plant and it is ephemeral. It goes away after, in May, it starts going away. So it is kind of a hard thing to pull. There's tons of vegetative little tubers in the ground that you can't pull. I mean, you'd have to like take the soil and sift it to get them out. So it is a difficult one to control. It really is more of an herbicide application to kill the leaves and probably having to repeat it often. Another way to treat it is to sort of cover it up with like a tarp for a while, to sort of try to solarize it or just keep it from propagating. But obviously a tarp kills everything. So that's another possibility. It is a tough one to get rid of. It really is a hard one.
Right. And for those of you that don't know about it, it's in the spring has a very visible yellow flower that's unfortunately, quite pretty actually.
Yeah.
That's how I learned to ID it, was using iNaturalist, taking pictures of the flower. Now it would be a little harder because the flowers are gone, but it's something to keep in mind for people to learn how to ID. So Nicole is pointing out, you talked about showy orchis before, and she's saying that she is seeing it in Herrontown Woods.
Yeah.
So good to know.
Yeah, that's a great one. And definitely local.
Right. Kristen Ace is asking about, she has a strike team in Morristown. And she's wondering if you'd be willing to meet with their town and men to discuss the importance of your program. Is that a part of your work?
Yeah, we do outreach in talks and things like that. We do actually, I mean, we do use them as a bit of a little fundraiser boost. So we typically will charge for doing presentations. I've had phone calls and things like that with different officials and, local officials and county officials around the state, just to sort of, just as an informal sort of consultation or whatever. But typically we've been charging for presentations.
Okay, thank you. So Robin is making a comment, which, is certainly a good one, that the problem is that most people just doesn't have an idea about invasives, what they look like, or I would add even what the problem is with them. So education is important. I couldn't agree with her more. I assume your website has a number of resources also
Sure.
detailing the different invasives and management procedures, correct?
Yeah, we have a fair amount of information on the website, technical, and even you had mentioned the state invasive species plan certainly has a lot of information in it. For folks that wanted to get acquainted with the issue. I think, well, that plan, like you said, it's like 200 pages, so you get more than acquainted with the issue.
Right.
But yeah, there are sources out there. There's a lot of regional and national sources as well of information out there.
Yeah.
You type in invasive plants and you'll latch onto a number of things. Something, I'm not sure how that worked, but something just popped on my screen that said the New York Prism, Lower Hudson Prism, which is definitely a good source of information. New York has a ton of, if you want to see me get jealous, look at my face when an email comes across on a listserv that I'm on, how New York has another $1 million in funding for invasive species control. They actually, take the problem much more seriously than in New Jersey.
Oh, wow.
They have a banned species list. That Lower Hudson Prism reference is a regional approach to invasives in New York State. And like I said, the state actually puts funding into invasive species work, as well as having a banned species list. So they really are a model that we should be following.
Okay. All right. So we have another interesting question from Emily Kurzabi, and that is that many invasive species seem to release aloe chemicals, excuse me, suppressing other plant growth around it. So are there natives that also have this feature in order to suppress invasives that are adjacent? We kind of touched on that earlier, but is there?
Yeah, I
um,
think, I mean, the most sort of known is walnut, that it does that. I mean, it's not like it suppresses all plant growth around it. You know, when you see a walnut out in the woods, there's plants around it. You know, so it does, it might suppress growth of particular species more than others. But it's not a lot of what, there's definitely that allelopathy, you know, for particular species, but it isn't absolute. And often it's more about the plant just grows densely and shades out other plants around it. So, you know, aggressively growing species don't have other things around it because it crowds them out and shades them more so than poisoning their neighbors.
Right. Okay. So we talked about bamboo earlier, and you mentioned the idea that it is problematic on a neighbor basis, but not necessarily on a broader basis. Jennifer added the question of, is it true that it doesn't provide anything for birds and insects? So it's not it adds to the kind of food desert that birds and native insects
Right.
would experience. Yeah.
I don't know for sure. I mean, it doesn't. I mean, it's essentially a large grass. So obviously, it doesn't have flowers or pollen for pollinating insects and things like that. It doesn't make fruit. I don't know how much the leaves get eaten. I don't really I haven't looked at bamboo enough to know. But if it doesn't have any holes or chew marks in its leaves, then bugs aren't eating it much either. So yeah, it's taking up space and providing nothing to the food web.
Yeah.
Would be my guess. Like many invasives. I mean, that's the key thing of why invasives are bad, because they're essentially pieces of ecological plastic. They're really not fully interacting with the ecosystem.
Right.
A lot of the reason why they do good is because bugs don't eat their leaves, which is the critical, you know, one of the critical things that plants do is they feed the whole system. And if nothing eats their leaves because there's no specialized bugs in their new invaded range, then they're not really participating in the ecosystem fully.
Right. Yeah. One thing I first learned when I was researching native plants was that if you found a native plant, or the way to identify potential native plants was if they had holes in their leaves. Because that meant that there was something eating it. And so, you know, I was raised to think, well, that's bad. That means you're not
Right.
managing it. So I thought I like
Right.
that idea of considering it more as food than,
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, that is sort of, there's an aesthetic and an ecological component to it, right? So, you know, in a garden, you don't necessarily want your plant totally decimated, but at the same time, um, you know, leaf holes are good. You know, that means that what you're doing is adding back to the ecosystem, and it isn't just an aesthetic thing. I find that beautiful, so there it's for it's good. Well, that's good for you and what you perceive as a beautiful plant. But if you want to give back to nature, you want to see some leaf holes.
right. Okay, so Nicole is asking that walking through her neighborhood, which is also my neighborhood, that we see Japanese barberry planted every other house, and it is now all over Herrontown Woods. So she said she heard there are plans to create a sterile Japanese barberry. Is that
Right.
true? And is it still legal to sell that?
Yeah. So barberry is a funny one. I mean, so people want barberry partly because their neighbors have it, and partly because even if they don't know anything about plants or invasive plants, they go to a garden center and they say, "Give me a plant that deer won't eat," and they sell them barberry. So it's kind of like, you know, the second swing around kicking you in the butt. You know, that it's an invasive plant that spreads because of deer, and people buy it because of deer. And the answer to the question was, yes, there is a nearly virtually sterile barberry that's been developed, I believe, in Connecticut. I assume that it's for sale. I mean, I don't know. But I've seen the research where, you know, fruit production goes from 1,000 to 2 fruit, you know, with seed in it. So it is much less potential to spread than the straight species of Japanese barberry, as opposed to this cultivar that's, like I said, not sterile, but virtually sterile.
Okay, good to know. So speaking of deer, we have an anonymous question of, you know, why exactly are there so many deer now? Did their predators disappear? Is that the reason?
Partly, but the bigger reason is us, as always. It's always our fault. It's not the deer's fault. It's not the invasive species fault. It's our fault. But we've made perfect habitat for them. So deer aren't a deep forest species. So if you think back to 1600 or 1500 or whatever, you know, you didn't have so much cleared area, and you certainly didn't have, you know, vast areas of farm. Even New Jersey has vast areas of farmland. So we've created a perfect salad bowl for them to walk around in. We have edges of forests and fields and agricultural fields with super abundant, super nutritious food for them. So we're feeding them more than they've ever been fed. So when ecologists, you know, research has been done, but when ecologists were thinking about what is the correct number of deer, what is the correct deer density? So the number is about 10 deer per square mile. And that's the best guesses of what it was in 1600 or 1500, whatever, you know, before Europeans came to America. So we now have in excess of 100 deer per square mile in the Hopewell Valley.
Wow.
So it's the problem is so far out of whack, it's almost unimaginable. You know, when you have 10 or even 15 times more deer than the ecosystem can handle, you know, yeah, the reasons why are fairly clear. We're feeding them really well, and we give them plenty of places where humans are now the only predator, right? Whether it's a hunter or someone driving their car. So there's plenty of places for them to get away from hunters around houses and things like that. So we feed them luxuriously, and we don't really have the ability to hunt them effectively, either because some hunters don't really want the deer population to go down on one hand, and on the other hand, deer have plenty of places to hide around houses. So we have more deer than there ever were. They love what we've done to the landscape. They absolutely love it. It's made them much more plentiful than they would be otherwise without us.
Right. Okay, so we've only got about 12 minutes left. And I hope you're hanging in there. It's a lot of questions for one night, but we do appreciate it. Why don't we try to run through the last ones that are here, and we'll just do some brief answers so that we can just push through them all. Does that work?
Okay.
All right. So David Puchowski, sorry about that, asked how he can remove nut sedge from his lawn.
That's extremely hard to kill too. It's not something that's considered necessarily an invasive species because it's not in natural areas or doesn't persist long in natural areas, but boy, does it persist in lawns. There are different nut sedge specific herbicides that are out there, and then one had a funny name, Sedgehammer. Sedgehammer.
Oh, wow.
I think that was the marketing name for it, but I think you'd have to use an herbicide specifically designed to get rid of that. It is very hard to kill.
Okay. All right. Then David Puchowski also asked about sharing the herbicide mixture table and proper application guide. That is on your website?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. So yes, maybe Christine or Molly can be looking that up and share that link with everyone. And we have a couple more vine questions. I know some of them you might have already addressed. An anonymous is asking, how can you remove or control English ivy and other vines coming in from your neighbors? And then what's safe for kids and dogs? We also have Kathy asked, is there a way to clear off strangling vines in a lot that has nobody living there, but is probably owned? Two interesting situations involving neighbors.
Yeah. I mean, English ivy creeping through under a fence or something like that, you can keep pushing back at it. I mean, in that case where there's really not much hope that you're going to kill the whole plant anyway, if only a little bit of it is sticking under the fence at a time, you could probably get away with using some of the organic herbicides that they really don't kill to the root, but they kill the top part of the vegetation. So if it's squeezing under a fence, you might use some of the organic herbicides that are out there. Some use vinegar or concentrated vinegar. So you might just do that because, a regular herbicide, when you're only spraying a tiny fraction of a larger plant, isn't going to kill the whole plant anyway. So you might as well just use an organic one in that case.
Okay. And then Joe is asking about a ground cover in a wooded area without deer fencing. We touched on the idea of the ground cover, but I don't know that we consider deer with that. So he's thinking ferns and wild garlic. Are there any other ideas?
Ferns are always a good choice. They're not 100% bulletproof, but they're 95% bulletproof typically. Sometimes deer like the fiddlehead stage of particular fern species, but in general, ferns are pretty darn bulletproof. So there's different types of ferns like that you could try out. I mean, I know ostrich fern is pretty good with spreading and sending out shoots and kind of forming little colonies. So that's a decent one to think about. It doesn't like a stitch of sunlight on it, so definitely make sure it's in shade. And there's plenty of other native fern species to pick from as well. But the one that comes to mind quickly is ostrich fern. Hay-scented fern also could spread once it's happy. Trying to think of other good spreading ferns. That most ferns, they plant at a spot and they stay in that spot and they don't spread vegetatively. They don't send runners out. But hay-scented fern and ostrich fern seem to cover ground.
Okay, great. So Jennifer's asking about pokeweed. What can we do about removing that?
Yeah, pokeweed is the native you love to hate sometimes. They're definitely an aggressive species. The birds love eating the fruit, so they carry it around and leave it behind them everywhere, apparently. You could use, it has a very big root, sort of like a tuber underground. So you might dig that part out. You might not get the whole plant, but at the base of the plant, there is a large tuber that if you removed it, that would certainly slow it down by a lot. I've also had some luck, just accidentally, dumb luck, I guess, letting it grow to its full height, cut it down, let it come up again, cut it down again, and you could exhaust it pretty quickly. It's a technique used on invasives in particular areas or situations, but I found that cutting it a couple times or a few times in a growing season really wallops it, and it could disappear. But there's a never-ending supply of seedlings, at least in my garden.
Okay, thank you for that. So John is asking, what are the fastest mover threats we need in New Jersey to be watching for and rapidly eliminating? So he's proposing kudzu, mile a minute, vine and porcelain berry.
Yeah, so kudzu for sure. We've done some tracking of that. There's about 3 dozen populations in the state. I have not been successful raising funds because I keep saying and asking people like, hey, we have a chance. It might cost, many thousands of dollars, even as what it is now, but we still have a chance to eradicate it. So it's always been a dream of mine to do that, but we haven't been able to raise the funds to do that. But we have an idea of, we know where at least 3 dozen populations are. And I got even a call this morning. I got a call from someone who found it in their backyard. So they keep popping up here and there. And as the weather gets warmer, the more likelihood is they are flowering and making seeds now in New Jersey. So that's a big problem because now they could spread more easily. I would say in my list, kudzu is number 1. My limited is a little too far gone at this point. It's very widespread throughout the state. And the third one was porcelain berry. You couldn't eradicate that from the state, but it's more of a, if you find it in an area and that hasn't really been before, you should definitely eliminate it. And I know there's more in Princeton than I know about, but there are a couple in Princeton that I know should be eliminated. But yeah, those are 3. The other ones that I worry about a lot are Siebel's viburnum, Linden viburnum, which is now unfortunately widespread, Oriental photinia, which is widespread in Princeton but not elsewhere in the state, and common buckthorn. Those are ones that really stand out to me as being highly threatening species.
Interesting. Okay. You've got a lot that keeps you up at night, it sounds like.
Oh yeah, no, it's like I said, it's you could find bad news on a daily basis.
Yeah.
When you
Right.
say, hey, we're here, tell us about what you see out there. People do, and you find out all kinds of things that you wouldn't have found out otherwise.
Right. So Hillary asked, you mentioned before a paper with Duke. She wants to know when that will be published.
That's in the revision stage right now. So I really don't know when exactly that might come out. But it's very close to getting its revisions and being accepted. And I don't know what their publishing schedule is like. I mean, does that mean it'll be published 6 months from now? I don't know.
Okay. All right, great. She also has a comment to check out the buttercup at Bowman's. I assume she means Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve, and she's saying it's right by the parking lot.
Do you know this? Does the person know the species name? I'd be curious.
She says Hispidus.
Which one?
Hispidus, Hispidus.
Okay.
She put.
Yeah, that's. I'm gonna look it up now because I haven't heard of it.
Yeah.
But you bought that from Moments Hill as a.
I think she was saying that it's growing there beside the parking lot.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's pretty. I'll have to look into that one. That's not one I've been familiar with up till now.
Yeah.
She
Looks
also
like a good one.
said in the chat that they are also selling it at Bowman's Hill.
Oh, neat. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a cool looking one.
Thank you, Christine.
Neat.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with that either. Okay, and then Jennifer commented that she has ragwort and it's growing exponentially. She doesn't want anything that'll grow up her trees, and she just finished cleaning them all off. So you've heard this before.
Yeah, it can definitely be an aggressive ground cover, and if that's what you're looking for, then that's a plant for you. Deer don't eat it either, so that's a good choice. It's evergreen, and you get flowers in the springtime. Yeah, I like I said, if you're in a drier, shadier spot, it'll be slower and less aggressive. If you're in a moister and sunnier spot, it'll be more aggressive. But if you're looking for ground cover, it'll definitely do that job.
Right. So 2 more questions we'll do quickly. Eve asked earlier, we were talking about a particular native plant that some people resented because it was so prolific, and she missed what it was. So Steve and Susan chimed in saying they thought it was golden ragwort. I feel like they're correct. Do you remember that, saying that about golden ragwort?
Yeah, that's the one we're just talking
Okay.
about. Yeah,
Right.
it can be very prolific if it's very happy.
Okay. And then Kathy is asking a follow-up question to her earlier one about the vine in the lot next door. I believe the question was that nobody's living in the house, but the vines are there. Is that something that you potentially speak to your council about? Because
Yeah, I mean,
you can't treat your neighbor's property, I assume.
right. I mean, we're the temptation level could be very high in certain circumstances like that. But I mean, I personally, I mean, I would defer to the landowner.
Okay, she's saying there's not a house. It is just a wooded lot.
I see. Yeah, I mean, obviously it would depend on who the landowner is. I mean, someone owns it. It's just a matter of who it is, which is,
Right.
you know, the tax records could help you identify who owns the parcel.
Yeah, I could see the frustration with that.
Yeah.
So maybe it's something where you could offer to maintain the land so that you're not dealing with that. And if it's not getting used for anything else, it's possible they wouldn't have a problem with that.
Right.
Anyway, just an idea. But with that, I'd like to wrap it up. I really want to thank you, Mike. You've answered a lot of a huge variety of questions that have come from all over the native plant and invasive plant world. And so we really appreciate your expertise in the area. And of course, appreciate all the hard work that you're doing to take care of this situation. So we really thank you for your time.
No, I appreciate being able to talk to folks. This is it's obviously near and dear kind of topic, so I'm glad people are interested in tons of good questions and good information. I'll have to look up that ranunculus species.
Right. And then, as we said before, we will also be sending out the link to the video, the recording of this. So if you're not yet on our newsletter, we encourage you to do that because you'll definitely get it. And otherwise, you can check on our website within a couple of days. And on the same token, don't forget about our campaign to identify all the plants and animals of Princeton. And so join us for that. So thanks, everyone, and have a good night.
All right, have a good night.
Thanks. And no, that's it.